It was a quiet December evening in Crestwood, the kind of suburban town where nothing ever seemed to happen. My best friend Sarah and I, both 16 at the time, were lounging around my house, bored out of our minds. In search of something to do, we decided to grab some fast food. The Burger Barn, just half a mile away, was our usual go-to spot. The weather was mild, and the fading daylight made the walk seem harmless, almost inviting. "Should we drive?" Sarah asked, already reaching for her coat. "Nah, it's just a quick walk," I replied, grabbing my phone. "Besides, I need to stretch my legs." Without a second thought, we headed out. Crestwood always felt safe, even at dusk. The streets were quiet, lined with neat lawns and dimly glowing porch lights. We chatted about school, boys, and random gossip, never imagining that what seemed like an ordinary walk would take a dark turn. When we arrived at the Burger Barn, something felt off. The usual dinner crowd was missing. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting an eerie glow over the nearly deserted dining area. Behind the counter, an older man, maybe in his 60s, was barking orders at two teenage employees. His gruff voice carried across the room, his accent making his words sound harsh and cutting. The employees looked flustered, keeping their heads down as they scrambled to keep up. Sarah leaned closer and muttered, "Guess someone skipped the customer service training." I smirked but said nothing. As we approached the counter, the old man's sharp eyes landed on us, lingering a little too long. "You girls just come from the beach?" he asked, his tone laced with something that wasn't quite humor. I glanced at Sarah. We were both wearing jeans and hoodies, hardly beachwear. "No," I replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. He let out a low, greasy chuckle before handing us our food. His gaze followed us as we walked to a booth near the window. "Creep," Sarah muttered under her breath. I nodded in agreement. We tried to shake off the weird encounter and focus on our food, but an uneasy vibe lingered. In the far corner of the restaurant, a man I hadn't noticed before stood up. He was middle-aged, dressed in a grimy work uniform. As he passed our table, something about him made my stomach twist. His eyes, they were an unnatural glowing green like something out of a cheap Halloween mask. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, stifling a laugh. "Yeah. What is he? A lizard man?" I joked, trying to keep things light. The man exited through a side door, and we went back to our conversation. But only a few minutes later he returned, this time carrying a large, misshapen bag. Instead of going back to his original seat, he chose a table uncomfortably close to ours, his back partially turned. Sarah nudged me. Why did he move so close? I shrugged, but my gut told me something was off. The man pulled an old laptop from his bag and set it on the table. As he powered it on, I caught a glimpse of the screen, and my blood ran cold. A video was playing. Two women, naked and restrained, in what looked like a filthy basement. A third figure dressed in black was whipping them. "Are you seeing this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded, unable to speak. The man adjusted the angle of his screen, making sure we could see it. The video wasn't some cheap horror flick. It was raw, amateurish, disturbingly real. Then, to make it worse, he started turning up the volume. Muffled cries and the sharp crack of a whip filled the near-empty restaurant. "We need to leave," Sarah hissed, grabbing my arm. Before we could move, the man shifted in his seat, tilting his head slightly as if gauging our reactions. His breathing was heavy, audible even over the disturbing noises from his laptop. My heart pounded. Behind the counter, the old man was still yelling at his employees, oblivious to what was happening in the dining area. "Let's go, now," I whispered, standing up abruptly. We grabbed our food and made a beeline for the door, not daring to look back. As soon as we stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The man was standing in the doorway, watching us. His green eyes glowed eerily in the dim light. "Keep walking," Sarah hissed, her voice tight with fear. But then I saw it. The black van parked at the edge of the lot. It looked like something straight out of a bad crime movie. Old, windowless, and menacing. The man walked toward it and my stomach twisted into knots. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Sarah's hand. We bolted across the street to a gas station, the neon lights flickering overhead. Inside, we pretended to browse the aisles, all the while keeping an eye on the parking lot. The van followed us. It pulled into the lot and idled near the entrance. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my mind racing. The clerk behind the counter gave us a suspicious look, probably thinking we were just a couple of teenagers up to no good. But I didn't care. All I could think about was the man in the van. The same man who had been watching us. The same man who had that sickening video on his laptop. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, the van drove off. We stayed inside for another 10 minutes, too scared to leave. When we finally stepped outside, every shadow felt like a threat. The walk home was the longest half-mile of my life. We kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting the van to reappear at any moment. When we reached my house, we locked every door and window before collapsing onto the couch in silence, too shaken to speak. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his glowing green eyes. I heard the muffled cries from that video. I don't know what his intentions were. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never feel completely safe again. The clock on my desk blinked 9:07 p.m. as I packed up to leave. Another long shift. Another holiday spent working while everyone else was out enjoying themselves. It wasn't out of the ordinary for me. Life didn't offer many chances to take time off, let alone spend it with loved ones. Not that I had many to celebrate with anyway. I threw on my jacket, feeling the cold of the winter air as soon as I stepped outside. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked toward the bus stop. The streets were unusually quiet, almost eerie, with most people tucked away at home, basking in the glow of Christmas lights. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me painfully that I hadn't eaten since lunch. Then it hit me. I had Burger King coupons in my wallet. It wasn't the most festive choice, but it was food. Besides, the thought of sinking my teeth into a warm Whopper was enough to get me moving toward the glowing red and yellow sign just a few blocks away. When I arrived, a sense of relief washed over me. The lights were still on, the open sign glowing brightly in the window. But as I got closer, I noticed the dining room was dark. A hastily taped sign read, "Dine-in closed, drive-thru only." "Great," I muttered under my breath. The thing was, I didn't have a car. I'd sold mine months ago to cover rent, and public transportation and walking had been my lifelines ever since. Still, I figured I'd try my luck. I stood awkwardly at the menu board as cars idled in line, their exhaust mixing with the crisp night air. When it was my turn, I leaned toward the speaker. Hi, can I place an order?" There was a pause before the speaker crackled to life. "Sir, are you walking through the drive-thru?" "Yeah," I replied. "I don't have a car, but I just need something to eat. It's Christmas Eve and everything else is closed." Another pause. I could almost feel the judgment coming through the speaker. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't take orders unless you're in a vehicle. It's company policy." "Come on," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "I'm not asking for much, just a burger and some fries." "I'm really sorry," she replied, sounding genuinely apologetic. "But if I let you, I could lose my job." I sighed heavily, the weight of the day pressing on me. "Fine. Merry Christmas, I guess." I turned to leave, muttering curses under my breath when a voice called out behind me. "Having some trouble?" I turned to see a woman stepping out of a car parked nearby. She looked to be in her mid-50s, her gray-streaked hair tied back neatly. Her coat was warm and expensive looking, and her eyes crinkled with a kind smile. "Yeah," I admitted. "Just trying to get some food, but they won't let me order without a car." She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Well, why don't you hop in with me? I can take you through the drive-thru." I hesitated. Something about getting into a stranger's car felt off, but she seemed harmless enough. Besides, I was starving. Are you sure? I don't want to bother you. Oh, it's no bother at all, she said, waving me toward her car. It's Christmas Eve after all. No one should go hungry tonight. I climbed into the passenger seat, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. She smelled faintly of lavender, and her car was spotless, almost unnervingly so. Thank you, I said, as we pulled into the drive-thru line. Of course, she replied, her tone warm and maternal. It's the least I can do. We made small talk while we waited, mostly her asking about where I worked, if I had family nearby, what my Christmas plans were. Her voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something odd about her demeanor. Her smile lingered too long, and her eyes never quite matched the kindness in her voice. When I finally got my food, I checked the time. 9:45 p.m. The last bus had already left. I stood by her car, awkwardly debating what to do next. You need a ride home? She asked, her voice gentle. No, that's okay, I said quickly. I'll manage. Nonsense, she replied, unlocking the passenger door. It's freezing out here. Where do you live? I hesitated, unease creeping back in. But the thought of walking 2 miles in the bitter cold made the decision for me. 14th and Willow, I said reluctantly. She nodded, a smile playing at her lips as I climbed back into the car. The drive started out uneventfully, with her keeping the conversation light, asking about my favorite holiday traditions, and sharing stories of her own Christmases. But then, she missed the turn for my street. You missed the turn, I said, glancing out the window. Oh, I know, she said casually. I just thought maybe you'd like some company tonight. It's Christmas Eve after all. I laughed nervously, hoping she was joking. Thanks, but I really need to get home. My dog's waiting for me. Her smile faltered for the first time, replaced by something darker. You sure? I've got some vodka at my place, or if you're into something stronger, I've got some blow too. My stomach dropped. No thanks, I'm in recovery. Her grip on the wheel tightened, her knuckles turning white against the leather. The air in the car shifted, the warmth replaced by icy tension. Look, I said firmly. I appreciate the ride, but I really need to get home. Just let me out here, and I'll walk the rest of the way. She didn't respond. Instead, she pressed harder on the gas, speeding through a stop sign. My heart pounded as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Let me out, I demanded, my voice rising. Her eyes flicked toward me, cold and calculating. You shouldn't spend Christmas Eve alone, she said, her voice eerily calm. Up ahead, a car was stopped at an intersection, forcing her to slow down. This was my chance. I yanked the door handle again, and this time it gave way. The cold air rushed in as I flung the door open and jumped out, hitting the pavement hard. My hands and knees scraped against the asphalt, but I managed to scramble to my feet and start running. Behind me, I heard her car screech to a stop. Wait, she called out, her voice sharp and desperate. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until the only sound was the rush of my own ragged breathing. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, my body trembling. I never saw her again, but every Christmas Eve I think about that night, about the stranger with the kind smile and dark intentions. I think about how close I came to trusting the wrong person, and how many others might not have been so lucky. My name is Eric Daniels, and every Friday evening after a long week of work, I treat myself to a Whopper with extra cheese at the Burger King near my apartment in Cleveland, Ohio. It wasn't just about the food, it was the routine. The smell of flame-grilled patties floating through the air, the warm lighting, the familiar faces of the staff. It felt like a small escape from my otherwise ordinary life. But that Friday, the weather was unforgiving. Sheets of rain blurred my windshield as I parked in my usual spot near the entrance. I debated staying in the car, but the craving was too strong. I grabbed my jacket and made a mad dash for the door. As soon as I stepped inside, something felt off. The cheerful ambiance I had grown used to was gone. The dining area was empty, and the usual sounds of trays clattering and customers chatting were replaced by an eerie silence. The only noise was the dull hum of the overhead lights and the rain hammering against the windows. I walked up to the counter, expecting to see Diana, the cashier who always greeted me with a smile. Instead, a tall, lanky man stood there. His face was expressionless, his eyes unsettlingly blank. "Welcome to Burger King," he said, his voice flat and lifeless. His smile was stiff, fake. "How may I serve you?" Something about him sent a shiver down my spine, but I dismissed it as my nerves, likely because of the weather. Yeah, a Whopper with extra cheese, please, to go." He nodded mechanically and turned toward the kitchen, disappearing behind the swinging doors. I glanced around the empty restaurant, trying to shake off the unease creeping over me. Minutes ticked by. My impatience grew as I checked the time on my phone. Where was my order? I walked up to the counter again, but no one was there. I leaned forward, trying to peek into the kitchen, but it was dark and silent. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet space. No answer. I was about to leave when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the back of the restaurant. I froze, my heart racing. Was someone calling for help? "Hello?" I called again, this time louder. The whisper grew slightly louder too, carrying a desperate, pleading tone. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. Maybe someone was hurt, or maybe I was just being paranoid. I walked past the empty booths, each step amplifying the sense of dread building inside me. The whisper led me down a narrow hallway at the back of the restaurant. The air was heavy and the fluorescent lights flickered ominously above me. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. The whisper was coming from inside. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but something, curiosity or perhaps a strange sense of duty, pushed me forward. I pushed the door open, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with steel cages. Inside each cage was a person, some huddled in corners, others staring blankly ahead. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. One man reached out through the bars, his voice barely a whisper. "Help us," he croaked. I staggered back, my mind struggling to process the scene. These weren't random strangers. I recognized some of them. People I'd seen in this very Burger King before, regulars, just like me. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, banging on the door and screaming for help. The whispers turned into wails, a cacophony of desperation and terror. "Let me out," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Please." Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost all meaning in that hellish place. Just as I was about to lose hope, the door creaked open. Standing there was the same vacant-eyed cashier who had taken my order. He gestured for me to follow him. I didn't trust him, but I had no choice. My legs felt like lead as I followed him through a series of hallways and staircases I never knew existed in a fast food joint. The air grew colder, the walls damp and covered in strange symbols I couldn't understand. Finally, we entered a large, cavernous room. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were adorned with grotesque murals depicting flames, sacrifice, and dark rituals. In the center of the room stood a massive contraption, a twisted blend of machinery and ancient-looking artifacts. I realized, with horror, what this place was. It was a sacrificial chamber. Around the edges of the room were more people, bound and gagged, their eyes wide with terror. The cashier walked to the center of the room, his movements mechanical, as if controlled by some unseen force. "This is where the fire burns brightest," he intoned, his voice emotionless. "You've seen too much. You must become part of it." I don't know what came over me, adrenaline, fear, desperation, but I acted. Grabbing a loose pipe from the floor, I swung it with all my strength, knocking the cashier unconscious. Chaos erupted as the other captives began screaming, their cries echoing through the chamber. I worked frantically to free as many as I could, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the locks. Together we made a break for it, navigating the maze of passages until we burst out into the stormy night. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, collapsing on the wet pavement as the rain washed over us. I called the police, my hands trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. But when they arrived, the restaurant was empty. No cages, no secret rooms, just a normal Burger King. To this day, I don't know if what I experienced was real or some twisted nightmare. The police dismissed my story and Burger King denied everything. But every time I pass that place, I feel the same dread I felt that night. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from the flame-grilled allure. Some cravings are better left unsatisfied. My name is Hannah, and if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that exhaustion can cloud your judgment. That's the only reason I can think of for why I decided to stop at an old rundown burger haven on a stormy Saturday night. I wasn't looking for trouble, I was just hungry. I had been working late at a secondhand bookstore in Greenville, South Carolina. It wasn't a dream job, but it paid the bills. That night, rain pounded the streets, and I hadn't eaten since lunch. My stomach growled as I drove past darkened storefronts, searching for anything that was still open. Then, I saw it. The red and white glow of a burger joint standing out against the downpour. It wasn't exactly inviting. The building looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. Pulling into the nearly empty lot, I noticed a single car parked by the side, a beat-up station wagon that looked abandoned. The rain distorted everything outside, making the world shimmer under the flickering neon sign. Inside, the place wasn't any more welcoming. The lights were dim, and the hum of the old fluorescent bulbs was louder than it should have been. A faint scent of grease hung in the air. Not surprising. Behind the counter stood a lone worker, a young guy in his 20s with a faded uniform and a name tag that read Kyle. He was tall and lanky, his messy hair and dark circles making it look like he hadn't slept in days. "Welcome to Burger Haven," he mumbled, barely glancing up. I hesitated. The place was eerily quiet. No customers, no music, not even the sizzle of food cooking. But my stomach was louder than my gut feeling. Can I get a cheeseburger and fries to go?" I asked, my voice sounding out of place in the silence. Kyle nodded and punched in the order. "That'll be $6.50. As I handed him a crumpled $10 bill, I tried to make small talk. "Slow night, huh?" He glanced up, his eyes dull. "Yeah, not many people come here anymore." "Why's that?" I asked, half joking. "Bad Yelp reviews?" Kyle didn't smile. Instead, he threw a quick glance over his shoulder toward the empty kitchen before leaning in slightly. "It's just, this place has a weird reputation." My stomach tightened. "Weird how?" Before he could answer, a loud bang echoed from the back like something heavy had fallen. Kyle jumped, his face going pale. "What was that?" I asked, my voice rising. "Probably nothing," he said, quickly straightening up. "Just the freezer acting up. Happens all the time." I wasn't convinced, but I nodded and stepped back toward the dining area to wait. The room was dimly lit, filled with faded red booths and scratched-up tables. A single family sat in the far corner. A man, a woman, and a little girl, maybe 8 years old. They weren't eating. They were just sitting there, completely silent. The little girl caught my eye. She was staring at me, her face pale and expressionless. When I gave her a small smile, she quickly turned to her mother and whispered something. The woman's face tensed, and she shot me a wary glance before leaning down to hush her daughter. The whole thing made me uneasy. I sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, trying to distract myself by scrolling through my phone. No luck, Wi-Fi was down, and my service was spotty. Great. A few minutes later, Kyle came out with my order, placing the bag on the counter with a weak smile. "Here you go. Have a good night." "Thanks," I said, grabbing the bag. I was about to leave when something caught my attention. The family was gone. Their booth sat empty, their plates untouched. "That's weird," I muttered to myself. I turned to Kyle. "Did that family leave already?" Kyle frowned. "What family?" I gestured toward the booth. "The one sitting right there. A mom, dad, and little girl." His face went blank. "There haven't been any customers here tonight. Just you." I let out a nervous laugh. Okay, funny. But seriously, where did they go? He shook his head, his expression unreadable. I'm not joking, you're the only one here. My stomach dropped. But I saw them. They were... Before I could finish, the lights flickered. A loud crash came from the back, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, like someone pacing. What the hell is going on? I demanded, backing away from the counter. Kyle looked genuinely terrified now. You need to leave, he whispered. I'm trying, I yelled, running toward the exit. But the door wouldn't budge. I yanked on it with all my strength, but it was locked, like some invisible force was holding it shut. A chill crept through the air. I turned just in time to see a figure emerging from the kitchen. A man. He wore an old Burger Haven uniform, but something was horribly wrong. His skin was pale and waxy, almost mannequin-like, and his eyes, completely black. Hannah, he said, his voice low and gravelly. My breath caught. How do you know my name? I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. You shouldn't have come here, he said. But now that you have, you'll stay forever. My pulse pounded. Stay? What the hell are you talking about? Before I could move, he raised his hand. A searing cold shot through me. My vision blurred. Then, darkness. When I woke, I was in a small, dimly lit room. Strange, glowing symbols covered the walls, casting eerie shadows. The air was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of something unfamiliar. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. Then the whispers started, faint at first, then louder, echoing. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting. Days passed, maybe weeks. Time lost all meaning. I pounded on the door, clawed at the walls. Nothing worked. The hunger was the worst part. It gnawed at me, a deep, unbearable pain that blurred the edges of my sanity. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door creaked open. I stumbled out. Bright lights, the dining area. The restaurant was alive again, booths filled with customers, voices chatting and laughing, staff moving cheerfully. I staggered to the counter, trembling. What happened to me? The cashier, a young woman with a bright smile, frowned. Are you okay, ma'am? I was in a room, I stammered, with symbols and whispers and... She frowned deeper. I think you need to sit down. Let me get you some water. I shook my head, stepping back. None of it made sense. Had I imagined everything? But then, through the kitchen window, I saw him. Kyle. He was staring at me, face pale, eyes wide with fear. Before I could say anything, he mouthed one word. Run. I didn't need to be told twice. I never went back to Burger Haven. Whatever happened that night, I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And I can still taste that sweet, metallic tang on my tongue. In the quiet town of Elmsford, nothing ever really happened, until the day Emma Sanders went missing. She was 11, the kind of kid who always waved at neighbors, rode her bike down the peaceful streets, and spent afternoons playing at the park just 2 blocks from home. Everyone knew Emma, so when she didn't come back one summer evening, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Her parents went on local news, pleading for help. The police launched search parties, and volunteers combed through the woods. For 7 long days, her face was everywhere, pinned to telephone poles, printed in newspapers, taped to the doors of every local business. On the 8th day, the posters came down. Emma's body had been found in a secluded clearing just beyond the woods. The details of her death, whispered in hushed voices, spread like wildfire. She had been tortured, the kind of horror that made parents clutch their children tighter, double-check their locks even in broad daylight. For weeks, Elmsford felt like a town under siege. People were wary of their neighbors, suspicious of strangers, and terrified of the unknown. But life had to go on. even with fear thick in the air. It was a Friday evening when my mom, exhausted from another grueling shift at the factory, decided we'd grab dinner at Burger King. It wasn't far from our apartment, just a short drive down Main Street. Burger King wasn't fancy, but for us it was a treat. Mom worked hard to keep things together, and nights like this, when she was too tired to cook, didn't happen often. "Grab us a booth, honey," she said as we stepped inside. The air smelled like fries and grilled patties, warm and familiar. "I'll get the food." I nodded, clutching her purse as I scanned the dining area. It wasn't crowded, just a few families, a group of teenagers, and an older man eating alone in the corner. I picked a booth by the window, sliding into the seat and placing the purse beside me. The gentle hum of the restaurant was comforting. The quiet chatter of customers, the beep of the fryers, a faint pop song playing overhead. I leaned back, idly twisting the paper wrapper from my straw, enjoying a rare moment of peace. That's when he walked in. I noticed him right away, not because he was loud or drew attention, but because something about him felt off. He carried a kind of tension, like he didn't belong. His clothes were dirty, his jeans torn at the knees, his jacket stained with something dark. Unlike most people who glance around when they enter a place, his eyes moved with purpose, scanning the room until they landed on me. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too eager, like he'd been waiting for this moment. I looked away, hoping he'd move on. But when I glanced up again, he was walking toward me. "Hey there," he said, stopping beside my booth. I froze, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "Hi," I murmured, barely above a whisper. "You here alone?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "No," I answered quickly, my eyes darting toward the counter where Mom was waiting for our food. "My mom's right there." He followed my gaze, then turned back to me, his smile never faltering. "That's good," he said. "Smart girl. Always stay close to your mom." I nodded, willing him to leave. But he didn't. He shifted slightly, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, rocking on his heels in slow, deliberate motions. "You hear about that girl?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated. "What girl?" I asked cautiously, though I already knew. "The one they found in the woods," he murmured, leaning in slightly. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Emma Sanders. Poor little thing." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisted. "Yeah," I said, my voice uneasy. "I heard about her. Terrible, isn't it?" he said, shaking his head. "What they did to her, just awful. You know, they say she was tortured, real bad stuff." The way he talked about Emma, like he was savoring the details, made my skin crawl. I didn't know how to respond. "You ever think about stuff like that?" he asked, his eyes gleaming. "What it'd be like to go through something like that?" "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Good." He smiled again. "You shouldn't. Too young for that kind of thing." Before he could say anything else, I heard my mom's voice, sharp and firm. "Can I help you?" I looked up to see her standing behind him, hands on her hips, her eyes blazing with anger. The man straightened, caught off guard. "Just talking to the kid," he said, his tone defensive. "Well, don't," Mom snapped. "Get away from my daughter." He hesitated, his eyes flicking between us. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. Two employees who had been watching from the counter followed him outside. Mom slid into the booth beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. I nodded, but my hands were still shaking. "That guy was weird," I said. Mom nodded. "He's not coming near you again," she said firmly. "We're getting you pepper spray, and from now on, you're not sitting alone." For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the memory of him. Every time I walked down the street or rode in the car with Mom, I found myself scanning the faces of strangers, looking for that same unsettling smile. A couple of times, I thought I saw him. Once riding a bike down Main Street, another time at the grocery store, but I could never be sure. Eventually, the sightings stopped. Life moved on, as it always does. But the fear lingered. Even now, years later, I still think about him. Who was he? What did he want? And most of all, why did he seem to enjoy talking about Emma so much? Weeks passed after the encounter at Burger King, but the stranger never left my mind. His face was burned into my memory. The way his smile had twisted into something sinister. The way he spoke about Emma with such eerie fascination. Every time I thought I saw him, a fleeting glimpse on a bike, a shadowy figure in a store, I felt that same wave of unease. Mom didn't let me out of her sight after that. She picked me up from school, walked me to the corner store, stayed close when we went out. At first, her protectiveness was comforting, but as the days turned into weeks and the stranger never reappeared, I started to wonder if I had overreacted. Maybe he was just a drifter. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. But then, one evening, something happened that made me question everything. It was a Tuesday night. Mom had just finished cleaning up after dinner. The news played softly in the background, the anchor's voice blending into the usual chatter about local events. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard Emma's name. "They've made a breakthrough in the case of 11-year-old Emma Sanders," the anchor said, her tone serious. "A suspect has been identified in connection with her abduction and murder." I froze, my fork hovering mid-air. Mom turned up the volume, her eyes narrowing as the screen cut to a mugshot. It was him, the man from Burger King. His name was Richard Mallory, a drifter with a history of petty crimes and a reputation for making people uneasy. According to the report, a tip from someone who had recognized him at a local convenience store led to his arrest. When police searched his belongings, they found disturbing evidence linking him to Emma's case. The details were horrific. He had been spotted lurking near the park where Emma was last seen. DNA evidence tied him to the crime scene. In his car, they found a notebook filled with unsettling drawings and notes, glimpses into the mind of someone deeply disturbed. As the news unfolded, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that he was caught. Dread that I had come so close to someone capable of such monstrous acts. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with the news. Everyone had their own theories, their own fears. Stories about Richard Mallory spread through town like wildfire, where people had seen him, how they had interacted with him, what they had thought of him. For me, it was a reminder of how small towns could feel both suffocating and isolating at the same time. Mom couldn't stop talking about it. "I knew something was off about him," she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. "The way he looked at you, it wasn't normal." I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say much. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, the way he had leaned in close, his voice dripping with dark curiosity. I wondered if he had been testing me, gauging my reaction, or if he had been planning something worse. A few weeks later, I saw him one last time, this time in court. Mom insisted we go to the hearing, saying it might help me feel safer to see him behind bars. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. When they brought him in, he looked different. The predatory gleam in his eyes was gone, replaced by something dull and resigned. But then his gaze swept the room and landed on me. And for a brief second, that smile flickered back. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Don't look at him," Mom whispered, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. The trial didn't last long. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than a day before delivering their verdict. Guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the trial, the town began to heal. Parents started letting their kids walk to school again. The park where Emma had last been seen filled with laughter once more. But for me, the scars lingered. I stopped going to Burger King. Even years later, the thought of sitting in that booth made my stomach turn. Sometimes I still dreamed about Richard Mallory. In the dreams, he was standing by my booth, leaning closer and closer until I could feel his breath on my face. Then I would wake up, heart pounding, and I would remind myself he was gone, locked away where he could never hurt anyone again. Life goes on, they say, and it does. But some things stay with you no matter how much time passes. Years later, I read an article about Richard Mallory. He had died in prison, beaten to death by another inmate. The news didn't bring me any comfort. It didn't bring Emma back. It didn't erase the fear he had left behind. But it did remind me of something Mom had said that night at Burger King as we drove home in silence. "There are some people in this world you can't reason with," she had murmured. "You just have to stay away from them." She was right, and because of her, I was one of the lucky ones who got away.